in November 2019, um, our brother comrade Evo Morales was overthrown in a coup d'etat in Bolivia. The hand of the United States government was very clear to people like me. When General Williams Kaliman came in and told President Morales, "You have to leave," it was clear because General Kaliman had been trained partly in the United States. We had seen over the 14-year period when the Mas government was in power in Bolivia. In that 14-year period, we had seen the U.S. Embassy conduct all kinds of games and reach out to the so-called opposition, including fascistic elements in Santa Cruz led by Camacho and so on. It was clear that this was a coup d'etat. And yet many people, even people who describe themselves on the left, began to say that, well, this is not a coup, that there could have been a fraud, etc., etc. They, in fact, absorbed some of the things that the Organization for American States, the OAS, which could be reformed into something different, but until the United States completely dominates it. 60% of the funding of this organization comes from the US. Most of the policies are driven by the US State Department and so on. So people began to accept what what Washington DC was saying, and what the fascistic elements in Bolivia were saying about what was happening in the country. And at the time, it occurred to me immediately that entire generations are losing the memory of, firstly, and specifically, the coup d'etats that have taken place in the 20th century into the 21st century. Let's say the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, from then all the way to the coup against Manuel Zelaya in Honduras in 2009. This long history of coups was not very clear to people, and particularly how the coup actually takes place. That was one thing that seriously bothered me. The other thing was that it seemed that people didn't understand the way in which, the details in which the CIA, US State Department, other US agencies operate. On the one hand, we've forgotten in a way the history of the coups. Also, we seem to have forgotten the specific way in which they operate. And so I pulled down from my shelves files and files of papers, many of them from the CIA. I pulled out my notebooks where I had interviewed members of the CIA who had retired. Chuck Cogan, for instance, a very fascinating man who late in his life told me details of CIA operations and how the CIA operates. Took down all this material, went through it again quickly, and in rapid fire, I wrote this book, which in English came out as Washington Bullets. And of course, I'm happy that there is a Spanish edition. Well, when I finished writing this book, and I'll talk in a few minutes about the writing of this book, it was my great honor to have the foreword to the book written by Evo Morales, because Morales, as I said, was the reason why I wrote this book, or rather the coup against Evo Morales was the reason why I wrote this book. And in the introduction, President Morales caught immediately the main point of the book. He said, the book brings to mind the infinite instances in which Washington's bullets have shattered hope. And that's the point of it, is these assassinations, these coup d'etats and so on, they break the confidence of people. They make people feel somehow that their own capacity to make history is diminished. And so that was one of the points of the book, and that's one of the features that Evo Morales brings out. The second point that Evo Morales brings out in the preface, in the foreword, in the front of the book, is in the last two sentences of his foreword. He writes, "We have the conviction that we are the masses and that the masses over time will win." And I'm going to come back to that at the end of my remarks. It's a sad story. in this book. I concentrate, of course, on the coup d'etat against the government of Jacob Arbenz in Guatemala. I tell that story in some detail. Except that this is a 160-page book in English, and I imagine it's not much different in Spanish. I tell it in detail, but it's a slim book. Several years ago, I was in South America when I met Eduardo Galeano, and I was a great admirer of Eduardo Galeano. His book, Open Veins of Latin America, was almost for me like a textbook on Latin American history. And then I read his book, Days and Nights, one of the best books on the period of the juntas in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, of course, Brazil, Paraguay, and so on. And what I asked Eduardo Galeano very sincerely, and also maybe a little naively, I asked him, I said, Eduardo, in your book, you write about terrible things, brutal things, tortures of people, and you describe to some extent the torture, but you don't describe it in great detail. You write about terrible things, torture of people in middle-class neighborhoods so that neighbors could hear the screams and then they wouldn't themselves get radicalized, or they would fear what would happen to them. So you wrote about terrible things, but your book is beautiful. How was that possible? And he said something to me that made me reflect a lot. He said that torture is a brutal thing, and the torturer wants you, by listening to the screams of the torturer, or of the tortured, the torturer wants you to be scared and wants your confidence to be diminished. And he said, why should writers, socialist writers, left-wing writers, why should we do the torturer's work for them? Why should we write the story of torture, write it in such a way that the reader has their confidence diminished? And I've thought about this in all these decades since that comment was made to me. I thought about this and thought very seriously about it. And so when I sat down to write this book, I thought, I don't want to write this from the standpoint of the CIA. I want a reader to read this book about the crimes of the CIA and of the US government, including the crime of the unilateral sanctions against Venezuela, the long crime against Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, and so on. I thought, I want to write this book so that when the reader reads it, they see the crimes, they recognize the crimes, but also they see the struggles and they understand hope. And the writing itself must create confidence and hope in the reader, which is why this book is filled with poems. And poetry is a very important way of indicating to a reader that everything is not lost, that if we keep struggling, we have not been defeated, as the Lebanese communist Mahdi Amel put it. If we keep struggling, we have not been defeated. As long as we resist, we have not been defeated. So that was, in a sense, the objective, was to tell the story of the coups, tell the story of the crimes of the CIA and others, detail that story as much as possible so people can understand how it works, how the CIA operates. And then, of course, tell that story in such a way that the reader doesn't feel diminished or destroyed by what they're reading. Now, the middle part of the book, the central part of the book, is a manual for regime change. And here I have 9 points, which begin with lobbying public opinion, and the last point is deny that it was a coup. Now, the reason I broke this up, I gave a structure of what a regime change operation looks like. The reason I did that in the middle of the book was so that a reader can both understand, and it uses the examples of Guatemala, a reader can both understand how a coup has taken place. Guatemala is an example. There's examples from Iran, from Guyana, from many places, including Burkina Faso and so on. You give the 9 points so a reader can understand how a coup happens. But hopefully, if there's ever a coup again, as there was in Bolivia in November last year, 2019, if there's ever a coup again, then you can follow the phases of the coup. Because let me tell you, these 9 phases, most coups in the 20th century just followed them perfectly. It's as if what I was trying to do was to take the CIA documents and systematize it into the CIA's theory of how to conduct a coup. And that's what the middle of this book is. The end of this book is about the kind of coups in our time. And there are a range of them. There's the coup, the ordinary coup. There was a coup in Thailand in 2014, a military coup. Military comes out, does a coup. That coup, government is still basically in power. There was a coup in Honduras. Yes, that was a coup. There was a coup in Japan against the government of Hatoyama. And, read about it. It's an interesting kind of coup. There was certainly a coup against Evo Morales and the MAS organization in Bolivia. Certainly that was a coup. That's one. Secondly, as Yanis Varoufakis put it, the Greek former finance minister of Greece, sometimes a coup can happen not with tanks, the military, but with banks. We've seen that, where the International Monetary Fund, other multilateral bondholders and wealthy bondholders and others put pressure on a government, and they say, well, you can continue to govern, but you have to surrender your whole policy. And in fact, that's what happened to Greece, which is why Varoufakis said that. It happened to the Tsipras-led government, the government of Syriza, the coalition called Syriza in Greece. Essentially, they surrendered their program in order to remain in power. And that was catastrophic. It was basically a coup. A little bit like what they did in Peru, where you call it the auto golpe, what Fujimori did. He did a coup against his own government, essentially. Invalidated whatever agenda you have. So that's the second. Third is this lawfare business, which you see, I think, quite powerfully in the case of Brazil, where they used lawfare, almost illegal ejection of the government of Dilma Rousseff, and then using the legal procedures to prevent Lula from running in the election. It was lawfare that they used to eject Correa and to prevent Rafael Correa from running for election in Ecuador. Lawfare is another technique, using legal democratic mechanisms to set aside the political process. And fourthly, we see this thing called hybrid war. And here, front line is Venezuela, where a range of weapons are used, from information warfare all the way out to trade and financial warfare. And so you're not dropping any bombs. You're not necessarily sending in the CIA to overthrow the government necessarily. You're doing it in a different way. You're using sanctions as a lever. And so this instrument is very important. On the one side, information warfare, the creation of a so-called, government, a separate government, Juan Guaido, pretender president, just invented by the United States. You create the Lima Group, which says, well, we are official. Who authorized the creation of the Lima? It's not an official UN group, and yet it will start to fund human rights reports done by the UN. And that's information warfare, saying that, well, no, it's a human rights catastrophe. Meanwhile, across the border in Colombia, every day human rights defenders are being killed, but nobody's pointing much of a finger there. It's towards Venezuela. This is the information part of the hybrid war. All the way out to economic warfare, because the world relies on the dollar, on dollar-denominated systems of finance and so on. And so you can jam that up and prevent a country from accessing basic credit markets. In the case of Venezuela, accessing its own money overseas, including, gold that is sitting in the Bank of England. So this is the other form in which the coup d'etat takes place, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. So it's important to know that in the period after the Soviet Union, interference by imperialism comes in many different aspects. The normal coup, through the banks, the IMF type of coup, let's call them. It comes through the issue of lawfare, as in the case of Brazil, spectacularly, and then the hybrid war. And this range of new techniques, nonetheless, are mirrors of the old technique, which one saw in Guatemala, in Iran, and so on. Not much different between the older techniques and the new ones. It's just that in the new techniques, you don't necessarily need the military, except in the first one, which is a pretty ordinary type of coup, where William Scaliman goes and sees Evo Morales and the police mutiny and so on. In the others, the bank, the coup of money, the coup of law, and the coup of hybrid war, in these you don't necessarily need the military to act. And this is what makes the current phase so much more need of intelligence and understanding. We need to clearly understand what's happening. But I want to come back to those two lines from President Morales. We have the conviction that we are the masses and that the masses over time will win. And I think this is what's important, that in Bolivia, the people continued to struggle after the coup, continued to fight at great personal cost to many of them. People died, and then they won. Look at the other end in Venezuela. People continued to mobilize and fight and defend their government and defend the Bolivarian revolution. And they've won. They haven't been overthrown. Look at the Cubans. From 1959, they've sat there and said, we are not moving. We are a dignified people. So the lesson of Eduardo Galeano is right. Yes, there's an ugly history, and I tell the ugly history. But we are not going to be defeated. We are continuing to resist. And our resistance is perhaps much more a view of the future than the history of the CIA. Revolution, as Fidel said, is the battle between the past and the future. And we have to struggle hard, resolutely, in a disciplined way to make sure that the future is ours. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the book.